The year is 1630. King Charles I sits on the English throne, facing increasing tensions with Parliament over religious and political matters. And it was this tension which led religious groups, such as the Puritans, to seek refuge in the New World, founding settlements like Plymouth, Salem, and Boston. To the south, the Dutch sought a different kind of colonial establishment, one that sought primarily to seek profit and to do business. And they strategically based these North American business operations out of a little-known outpost on the mouth of the Hudson River, which they called New Amsterdam. But what if the English had founded one more settlement in the New World? One whose roots were planted in the idea of trade and commerce, like those of the Dutch. Off of the coast of northern New Hampshire, a new colonial settlement is taking shape. This is Lockport, a brand new city skyline series, chronicling the development of a North American city, from its founding in 1625 all the way into the modern era. My name is Mark, and I absolutely love urban history. If you're already a City Skylines fan, you might be familiar with a different city skyline project called Franklin, a series by YouTuber and podcaster Justin Rosniak, who also goes by the YouTube handle Do Not Eat. His series is absolutely an inspiration for my series, and I wanted to give credit where it's due. But I want to do something a little different. We're going to talk about history, architecture, development patterns, and politics. But we're also going to tell stories about the city, the people who lived in it, and the way that they shape our history. So without further ado, I welcome you to episode 1 of Lockport, a completely fictional American city on a hill, where together we'll explore the history of North American cities. Okay, let's rewind. It's 1618, and veteran sailor and explorer Matthew Gray is sailing across the Atlantic, leading a brand new expedition to North America. So why has he been commissioned for this expedition? Well, he's been hired by the British East India Company, a mega corporation of its time, seeking a northwest passage in order to find a lucrative shipping route to Asia. However, as fate would have it, it would not be the Northwest Passage which would earn Matthew Gray his claim to fame, but instead it would be his discovery of a little-known island off of the northern coast of North America. According to the captain's diary, on September 6, 1618, the crew unexpectedly spotted land off of the coast of what is now northern New Hampshire or southern Maine, and to their knowledge, this had not been previously mapped. Gray immediately understood the importance that this island might have in regards to future settlement and trade. He writes a detailed account of the island in his diary. Quote, "The island is very large. It contains a great sheltered bay in which our ship found safe harbor, and to the north contains many tall cliff faces and waterfalls which flow into the sea. It is a sight to behold. The bay and the sea contain a wealth of oysters, codfish, and other sea urchins. The native people of the island sailed out to us on their canoes and offered us gifts of maize and other produce, beaver skins, and many beads and shells. Upon their arrival at the island, John Silver, a prospector who accompanied Matthew Gray on the journey, wrote in his journal, "I have never witnessed such natural beauty as there is here on this remote island. If there ever was a fabled land of Canaan, this would be the place." The native peoples who came out to meet Matthew Gray and his crew were part of a local tribe of Abenaki people who had been living on the island for many centuries. Their lifestyle consisted of seasonal planting and farming in small communities, but also hunting, gathering, and fishing. Many of the small communities of the island were not comprised of permanent residents of the island, and instead were comprised of visitors who came and went depending on the season or the year. This is due in part to the fact that the people who depended on this island for resources did not conceive of property in the same way that Europeans conceive of property. The Abenaki believed that land was not owned, but instead used according to custom, season, and need. Nonetheless, let's make no mistake, Abenaki people had been living on this land for a long time despite European claims that the New World was an unclaimed and unspoiled wilderness. Upon returning to England, Matthew Gray published an account of his expedition. In it, he describes the island as a new Arcadia, referencing a region of Greece located in the central Peloponnese, which was often depicted in European Renaissance art as a utopian, unspoiled, harmonious wilderness. Despite having little to show for his journey materially, his account caught the attention of wealthy merchant and financier, Lady Margaret Locke. Matthew Gray was recommissioned by Miss Locke to set sail for Arcadia and set up a trading post with the local peoples. In 1623, the monarchy granted a royal charter to the Arcadia Bay Company, financed by Locke, granting the company exclusive trading rights in what will come to be known as the Arcadia region. The company envisioned the new trading post as a small but profitable operation, trading in furs, fish, and lumber, and its location off of the northeast coast made it an ideal stop for traders on their way to and from other ports of call. The company recruited 35 families to set sail with Matthew Gray for the New World and appointed Gray as the first company director of the new settlement. In 1625, after a grueling 10-week journey across the Atlantic, colonists made landfall and began to set up camp in the new colony. So what you're looking at here is the building process for the Abenaki settlement of Pawtuckaway, and this is located on the far side of the island. We're going to go over the geography of the island in a bit more detail in the next segment, but for now, enjoy the process of this settlement being built, and I'll take this time to talk a little bit more about the Abenaki. The Abenaki were a group of Algonquin-speaking Native American people who inhabited the northeastern portion of North America, which included New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and parts of southern Canada. They comprised many distinct, loosely associated communities, but who all shared a strong cultural background. So the members of the community on this island, they absolutely would have had their own distinctive community with its own flavor and its own tradition, but we would today consider them to be part of the larger Abenaki cultural group that inhabited this region of the United States. So, according to Moose on the Loose, a social studies guide for grade school students in New Hampshire, which is just an awesome name and not gonna lie. Anyway, they would have you believe that the Abenaki lived in peace and harmony with the English settlers, that they participated in trade and benefited from it, that they helped the settlers learn how to plant crops and survive in the New World, and that they continue to live in peace and harmony to this day. In fact, they even mention how descendants of the Abenaki people are still living in New Hampshire today, and there's a picture of two very happy people. They mention that many Abenaki-inspired place names still live on in the state of New Hampshire, and they provide a map with some of those names. And the article praises the Abenaki respect for the natural world and the environment. And while many of these claims are true, this really just leaves out a lot of important information, right? Now, look, Moose on the Loose is a resource for kids. I understand that maybe we don't want to provide material for kids that is not age appropriate for them, but I think kids can handle a bit of nuance about the actual history of colonialism. So in this series, we're definitely going to talk about that stuff. I'm not going to whitewash history and pretend that colonialism didn't happen. As we begin to develop Lockport, we're going to have to confront the reality of indigenous displacement, cultural erasure, and physical violence. But I also just want to take a moment to point out that I am not a historian, even though I am a big fan of learning about history. So if you notice any factual inaccuracies or you want to make a correction, by all means, please let me know, and I will absolutely issue a correction, because I want to be a responsible steward of historical information. During the first years of the colony, it's likely that the settlers would begin surveying the land around them. From the point of view of the colonial administrators, the primary purpose of land surveys was to establish property boundaries and ensure orderly settlement and land distribution. Land surveys were essential for creating a legal framework for land ownership. However, as we touched on before, there are already people living here, so you see how this is going to lead to conflict. So let's follow one of those surveyors around the island so that we can get a quick lay of the land here before diving into our development. Jonathan Woods, who the company will later appoint as Lockport's first captain of the militia, led the first survey of the island in 1626. He was accompanied on this expedition by a local sachem and guide named Katona, who believed that ongoing trade and good relations with the English would bring prosperity to his tribe, even despite some apprehension about their intentions. Katona shared a wealth of knowledge with Woods, including place names. However, generally, Woods only incorporated these Abenaki place names into his survey if they were easy to pronounce or if he found them useful for facilitating communication with local tribes. Therefore, many of the traditional place names of the island will become lost to time. So whether this was intentional or not, this really facilitated the erasure of Native American culture. Okay, so let's get a quick lay of the land here. The most important feature of the island in regards to urban development is the large sheltered bay on the southeast of the island. This is what makes Arcadia Island such a great place for settlement, because sheltered bays provide, as the name suggests, calm water and safe harbor for vessels, and this facilitates trade. They also offer a military advantage because of their narrower entryways. The colonists named this area Gray Harbor after their industrious company director, and this is where they will plan their initial settlement. Gray Harbor is surrounded by 3 distinctly separate geographical regions. To the east, we'll notice a long peninsula, and Woods refers to this peninsula as the Long Neck. This is a pretty big area and on its own just contains a wide variety of geological features. So as the city expands, we'll definitely explore more on Long Neck and it'll become a very important place in our metropolitan region. To the north, we'll notice a steep slope leading up to a small mountain range. Katona refers to this area as Hookset, meaning place of beautiful trees. And so this naturally is going to become the Hookset mountain range. Woods also labels the foothills of these mountains on his map as Woodhill. Very suspicious, Mr. Woods. West of the bay, a second mountain range extends through the middle of the island. almost dividing it in half. We learn from Katona that these hills are known as Sauhegan, translated to Great Watching Place, due to the superior vantage point offered from their peaks. The Pennacook River, meaning at the foothills, flows down from these mountains into the bay. At the mouth of Gray Harbor, we find an extensive wetland with a sandy beach called Meadow Creek. To the west, the island's longest river carves a deep valley through a series of hillsides. Woods labels this river West River, but this appears to have been a placeholder name, and we'll see in future episodes how this name changes and why it changes. Finally, we turn to the north. This is where we find the village of Pawtuckaway. However, Woods misinterprets the name, possibly on purpose, and abbreviates it down to Tuckaway. This may have been an attempt to Anglicanize the name of the settlement. There are two small islands off of the northern coast, and they receive the names Fox Island and Duck Island. Despite the absence of any foxes or ducks on either island, we'll never really know why he decided to name them this. The last notable feature to touch on before beginning the development of our settlement are the north-facing rocky cliffs of the Hookset Mountains. These cliffs are dotted with waterfalls, and remarking on the deep sense of serenity that this area evokes for him, Woods calls this place Serenity Point. The cliffs extend toward a shallow bay containing a large wetland area. Upon noticing a congregation of otters near the bay, Woods dubs the place Otter Cove. Okay, so that concludes our survey. And folks, we have finally made it to the build portion of the episode. So we're going to be basing this build on Plymouth Plantation, and that's what you're looking at here. Here in the US, we have a lot of mythology surrounding the Pilgrims and their settlement at Plymouth. I think a lot of people might think that Plymouth was the first English colony in America, or that it was the first successful English colony in America. Neither of those things are true, but I do think that this is a great starting place for our build. And the most important reason why is because I have a map of it. And I wasn't able to find a map of very, very early New Amsterdam, which is New York, and I would have loved to have had that. But Plymouth works just fine because it's a really good representation of the English style of settlement at this time. So you'll notice on the map on the top left, you see a structure there that looks kind of like a fort, like it's a walled defensive structure, and that's what we're building here. A fort like this would not have been very formidable. It would not have been constructed very well. It was probably constructed very hastily, but they were important to have, in large part as a signal to other colonial powers to say like, hey, we have, some capability of defending our settlement. But during this early period of settlement, forts also served as a meeting place and a place of administration. And so my goal in building this fort was to depict all of those things, with an emphasis on the shoddy build quality. You'll see later on I kind of make it so there are weeds sort of rooting away at the foundation, and I put a pigsty next to it, which by the way is historically accurate because in New Amsterdam, Fort Amsterdam actually had a real problem with pigs roaming around the fort and causing real damage to the fort. And so the settlers actually referred to it as more of a molehill than a fort. So what I'm doing here is that I'm starting to lay out some houses down the main street. And something you'll notice about these houses is their architecture. I think that some people might have a certain expectation about what colonial architecture looks like. So, for example, if you've ever been to an East Coast city like Philadelphia or Boston, you may have seen these old colonial row homes. Or if you've been out to Cape Cod, you may have seen like old colonial salt box homes. But in reality, that style of architecture came much, much later than this. I've been reading a book called A Field Guide to American Houses. I've been finding this book extremely useful in research for this series and just for my own entertainment and knowledge. I think it's great. So I learned from this book that early settlers of the Northeast brought with them a post-medieval architectural tradition, meaning a lot of the early structures that were built at this time, they really would have resembled the architecture of late medieval England. In fact, if you go and visit the replica of Plymouth Plantation today, you'll find that the style of these homes really resembles more of like a shack than any kind of modern idea of what a home is that we might have today. So these early settlers really had no creature comforts, and they were really roughing it out here in these early years. Really, at this point, this settlement's number one priority is survival. In fact, several North American colonies had already failed at this time, including 2 English colonies. Roanoke Colony is probably the more famous of the 2 because nobody actually knows what happened in Roanoke because everybody disappeared. It's an unsolved mystery of history. And the other failed colony was Popham Colony in Maine. So they probably would have been aware that people had tried this before and it didn't work out for them. So as we move away from the main settlement here, you'll notice that I'm starting to parcel out these larger tracts of land, and this is a good segue into talking about what I'm sure must be everyone's most anticipated part of the episode. That's right, we are going to talk about land ownership and land distribution. I'm sure everyone is just dying to hear about land distribution in colonial America. But no, it's actually a very relevant and super interesting topic. So in order to start talking about this, let's go back to our story and follow our settlers as they disembark. When the settlers arrived on the island, they found it mostly empty. This is due to the introduction of European diseases to the native population during their initial contact, causing 90% of the indigenous population to perish. When the settlers landed, they thought this was a divine intervention, paving the way for colonization. In reality, the indigenous population simply didn't have any built-up immunity to these diseases. Nevertheless, the settlers wanted to maintain a good relationship with the remaining native population for trading purposes and, frankly, for survival purposes as well, since they needed all the help that they could get trying to get this new colony up and running. To that end, they made strides to offer gifts to the local population and purchase land according to their legal standards of the day. The settlers claimed to have purchased the entire island from a group of indigenous representatives, but there is no record of this transaction actually happening. Furthermore, these representatives could not have possibly represented all of the tribes living in the area, and it's possible that they would have thought the arrangement temporary due to their communal understanding of land ownership. Nevertheless, the settlers now believed that they possessed legal ownership of the entire island and began settling it. Now, the vast majority of people coming over here to this colony, they would not have been landowners. I can't stress that enough. This would have been a collection of people who had agreed to come and work for wages for the chartered company. So many of these early towns, they were really essentially company towns. So if the people who lived there didn't own this land when they came here, then who did? Well, it would have been the shareholders of the company. You see, these companies didn't operate that differently from the way a modern corporation operates. They had investors and financial backers, and these people expected dividends from the company's profits, but they also expected land grants from the company's administration. The company's shareholders would have been comprised mostly of merchants and people that the company referred to as adventurers, but really what an adventurer was just a rich person who decided to invest in this company and invest in land ownership and industry in the New World. The most common type of industry these people would invest in were these large farming estates. And on Manhattan, these Dutch farming estates were referred to as the Boweries. And so if you've ever been to a neighborhood on Manhattan called the Bowery, that's actually where this name comes from. It's a Dutch name for a farming estate. Boweries were part of a larger system, however, and this system was called the Patroon System. This was a system that was established by the Dutch West India Company, which allowed large landholders or company directors called patroons to acquire extensive land grants in exchange for bringing worker settlers into the colony. These patroons controlled vast estates, and they rented their land to tenant farmers. Farming estates provided opportunity for employment for the company workers, but it was also a way of consolidating wealth through property. At the same time that this was happening in New Netherland, which in a lot of ways resembled the feudal structure of 16th and 17th century Europe, there was a new and some might say revolutionary system of land ownership emerging in New England. Now, don't get me wrong, major investors in New England colonial charter companies were still overwhelmingly wealthy, and they were still granted things called land patents, in which colonial elites were able to claim and develop substantial tracts of land. However, in New England, a substantial portion of settlers were freeholders who owned their own land. Freeholders owned their land outright, and they had full rights to it. They usually would receive a small land grant directly from the colonial authority, and this land was typically distributed in small individual plots. It may not sound like such an important distinction that in New Netherland there were almost no freeholders, but in New England there were some, but they didn't own a lot of land. To our modern sensibilities, that doesn't seem like that much of a difference, and inequality was still a huge problem in New England. But for its time, this was really quite a revolutionary thing. These ideas reinforced a sense of independence and self-reliance among New England colonists. It also facilitated the participation in local governance, a small but important sense of economic self-sufficiency, a sense of social equality, again in a small but for the time very meaningful way, and it led to the idea that landholders were entitled to representation in decisions affecting their lives. So with all that being said, here in our small little burgeoning community, the colonial authority is going to grant the chief investor in the Arcadia Bay Company, Margaret Locke, the vast majority of land holdings in this new colony. And because of this, this little community is going to take on the name of Lockport. This is almost like how the Bronx is named after a person named Johannes Bronk, who owned nearly all of the land up there and had a massive farming estate. And people just called that area Bronx land, and then eventually that morphed into the Bronx, and that's how it got its name. The second largest land grant in this community is going to go to Company Director Gray, and this was also a common practice in these colonial companies that the company director would get a significant amount of land in return for their service and stewardship. Peter Stuyvesant, who held the longest tenure as company director of New Amsterdam, he got a tremendous amount of land in New York City. In fact, there are tons of places named after him, but we'll talk more about him in future episodes. So between Lady Locke and Director Gray, these two massive grants of land are very in line with the Dutch patroon system and the English system of patronage, which awarded land patents. However, I'd like to mix in some of the New England style of land ownership in here, and so also in our colony, we're going to say that a significant portion of the settlers became freeholders. So that way, as we move through history, we can explore both elements of New York City history and New England history. I really like the idea of mixing together a little bit of New York history, a little bit of Boston history, a little bit of political history, and the history of land ownership really informs just so much of the history of the development of northeastern cities and of the forces that drove that development. So that's just about going to do it for episode 1, and I really want to thank you for sticking it out this long and sticking around for the ending here. As you can see, I'm just wrapping up some of the finishing touches on our colonial settlement, and next episode we're going to do our first expansions. I'm really excited for that. I have some very cool plans for this project, and I hope that you'll stick around and get to see this city get built one step at a time. We are not going to rush through this. We're going to do it right, folks. And we're going to end things out here with a big sweeping shot of the first trading vessel arriving in the port of Lockport. So hopefully that'll leave you with a little prelude to next episode. And as we transition into some nice cinematic shots that we can watch of our final settlement, I want to take this time to extend a number of special thanks to people who helped make it possible for me to start creating this series, because there were so many custom assets that had to be made for this. And I'm not much of an asset creator myself, so I needed a lot of help with this. And there are at minimum 2 people that deserve some really special thanks for this. The first person that I want to thank, their name is Magic, and they're a content creator on the Steam Workshop. They release a lot of historical assets and a lot of historical sim sets, like people sets. And together, we were able to create this set of early colonial American sims. And you'll see them walking around a lot more in subsequent episodes, but this took so much time and effort. You have no idea. It's unbelievable. Frankly, he did most of the work on this, and I just need to extend the deepest, most sincere thank you for helping with this. The second person who I need to extend a really special thanks to is a fellow YouTuber, Gaseous Stranger. He has this amazing series where he's doing this one-to-one recreation of Pittsburgh. He's an incredible city builder, an incredible creator, and of late he's been getting into 3D modeling and putting out assets onto the workshop. Before starting this series, I knew that I needed to put together a set of old sailing vessels to populate the harbor. Gaseous Stranger was the person who helped me remodel these sailing vessels into a format where we could bring them into the game and use them as assets. So I just want to extend to you, Gaseous Stranger, a very deep, sincere thank you for helping me with these sailing ships. So this is where my third very special thanks comes in here, because after Gaseous and I were able to bring these ships into the game as props, I realized that they were not bobbing around in the water, and it seemed kind of unrealistic to me, and I wanted to figure out how to make that happen. So I reached out to content creator Evangeline, who puts out a lot of historical naval vessels or 18th, early 19th century steamships out onto the workshop, and she showed me how I could run some scripts in order to make the boats bob around in the water, but also how to turn them into functional ship assets that would be able to run the routes and like sail in and out of the harbor. I don't personally care whether they're really serving any real function for the city, as for me this is just a model city and I'm not building this in any real functional way. But as a prop that is able to go in and out of the harbor, that's a huge deal. So again, Evangeline, that was so kind of you to help me figure out how to do this and to help me implement those scripts into the assets. So for all 3 of you, for Magic, Gaseous Stranger, and Evangeline, thank you so much. You have truly helped bring this project to life, and I am very, very grateful. Lastly, I want to thank you, viewer, anonymous person watching this video on the other side of the screen. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time touting this, but I do want you to know that I've started a Patreon. Unfortunately, I can't offer very many benefits or anything because I just don't have enough time for that. But if you want to help support the channel by helping me pay for things like subscriptions to music licensing services, or perhaps in the future commissioning certain special assets so that I don't have to try to keep doing it on my own, then your support on Patreon would go a really long way toward that. But I'm not going to spend any more time talking about it. Just going to let you know that it exists and you can go there. I also want to share some of my future plans for this series before we make our final sign-off. First of all, I can tell you that there is not going to be a consistent release schedule for this series, and it's not going to be frequent. That is just the reality of my situation as somebody who works full-time and goes to school in the evening and has a number of other commitments, that this is really a side project for me. And so even though I really care about it and want to do something cool here, I just don't have a preponderance of time for it. And so you can definitely expect that I care about it and I will keep working on it, even if episodes aren't being released often. And maybe a way to do that is to make subsequent episodes a little bit shorter. And if you have thoughts about this, let me know. But I'm thinking that every episode we're going to cover like a few years worth of development. So there'll be like several different development projects that happen in each episode. In the next episode, we're going to develop the waterfront and we're going to densify the city center. We're also going to build some really large farming estates like I've been talking about and have them sprawl out over the Gray Harbor area. And we might also build a second settlement across the bay. I'll have to make a determination on like how much progress I'm making and whether I can do that or not. But those are plans for the immediate future. If you have any ideas of topics you want covered, let me know. Drop me a line. It'll probably be a while before we get another episode. And but again, thank you so much for watching. And I have run out of things to say. So see you next time.